The notification chimed softly on my phone at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same gentle ping that had been quietly building my fortune for the past 15 years. I was sitting in my modest living room in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, surrounded by the kind of floral wallpaper my daughter claimed was hopelessly outdated and furniture my son insisted belonged in a museum. The glow from my laptop screen reflected off my reading glasses as I watched another cryptocurrency transaction complete successfully, adding another $12,000 to an investment portfolio that none of my family knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Myrtle Jackson, they called me. 63 years old, widowed for 8 years, and according to my 3 grown children, completely clueless about anything invented after 1995. They spoke to me like I was a relic, explaining smartphones with the patience reserved for toddlers, rolling their eyes when I asked questions about social media, and generally treating me like a sweet but helpless grandmother who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of modern life. If only they knew that while they were patronizing me about how to use email, I was quietly managing a $300 million investment empire from my kitchen table. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman they considered technologically incompetent, executing complex algorithmic trades, analyzing blockchain technologies, and making investment decisions that would make their financial advisors weep with envy. But they saw what they expected to see, a lonely widow who knitted afghans and watched too much television, not a financial strategist who had turned her late husband's modest life insurance payout into generational wealth. The notification that had just pinged was from my cryptocurrency exchange, confirming that my latest Ethereum purchase had gone through. I'd been tracking the market patterns for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment when the price dipped below my target threshold. While my family slept, dreaming their small dreams and living their conventional lives, I was building something extraordinary in the shadows of their assumptions. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, checking my diversified portfolio spread across 17 different platforms and investment vehicles. Real estate investment trusts, emerging market bonds, sustainable energy futures, artificial intelligence startups, and yes, even some of those internet coins my son Marcus had once mocked as fake money for people who don't understand real economics. The same Marcus who worked as a mid-level bank manager and still asked me to help him with his car payments. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, where tomorrow's grocery list sat on the counter next to a stack of what my children assumed were routine bills and Social Security paperwork. They had no idea that mixed in with the mundane correspondence were communications from investment firms, patent attorneys, and technology incubators from around the world. To them, I was just mom, shuffling through paperwork she couldn't possibly understand. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of trains passing through town. This was the time I loved most, these late evening hours when I could drop the pretense and be who I really was. Not the befuddled widow my family pitted, but Myrtle Jackson, investor, strategist, and architect of a financial empire they couldn't even imagine. It hadn't always been this way, of course. 8 years ago, when Robert died suddenly of a heart attack at 61, I was exactly what they thought I was now, a traditional wife and mother who had spent 35 years supporting her husband's career as a high school principal while raising 3 children. I knew how to balance a checkbook, clip coupons, and stretch a grocery budget, but complex investing seemed as foreign to me as rocket science. The transformation began with necessity. Robert's life insurance had provided a modest sum, enough to pay off the house and live comfortably if I was careful, but not enough for the kind of retirement security I wanted. My children, well-meaning but condescending, had immediately started making plans for my financial future. They wanted to set up simple savings accounts, maybe a conservative CD ladder, something safe and appropriate for someone your age, Mom. But I had always been curious, always been a learner, even if my family had never noticed. While they saw a housewife, I saw someone who had managed complex household logistics for decades, someone who had researched every major purchase, someone who had successfully navigated insurance claims, tax preparations, and budget optimizations that would challenge many corporate managers. The skills were there, I just needed to apply them differently. So I started reading. At first, it was basic investment guides from the library, the kind with large print and simple explanations. But I was hungry for more. I discovered online courses, financial blogs, investment forums where brilliant minds shared strategies and insights. I learned about market psychology, technical analysis, fundamental research. I studied companies, industries, global economic trends. My children, when they bothered to notice my new interest, found it charming. Mom's trying to learn about the stock market, they'd say with indulgent smiles, the same tone they used when I attempted to use a new television remote. They assumed it was a harmless hobby, like Sudoku or crossword puzzles, something to keep my aging brain occupied. They never asked for details. They never inquired about my progress. They simply patted my hand and reminded me to be careful with those risky investments before returning to their own lives and their own financial struggles. My daughter Sarah was drowning in student loan debt from her master's degree. Marcus was leveraged to the hilt with a mortgage he couldn't really afford. My youngest, David, was perpetually between jobs, convinced that his next entrepreneurial venture would finally make him rich. Meanwhile, I was quietly building something remarkable. The first year had been terrifying and exhilarating. I started small, investing just a few $1,000s in a mix of index funds and blue-chip stocks. I made mistakes, certainly. I bought high and sold low more often than I care to remember. But I learned from every error, studied every loss, and gradually began to understand the rhythms and patterns of the market. By the second year, I had discovered cryptocurrency, back when Bitcoin was still considered a curiosity by most mainstream investors. My children would have been horrified if they'd known I was putting money into internet funny money, as David had once called it. But I saw something they didn't: the potential for revolutionary change in how financial systems operated. I started with just $500 in Bitcoin, treating it as a learning experience more than an investment. I researched blockchain technology, studied white papers, joined online communities where programmers and investors discussed the future of digital currency. My family, meanwhile, continued to explain to me how email worked and why I shouldn't click on suspicious links. The transformation was gradual but steady. Small gains became larger ones. Successful investments funded more ambitious strategies. I learned about options trading, currency markets, emerging economies. I began investing in startups through equity, crowdfunding platforms, backing technologies and innovations that my engineering background helped me understand better than most. Yes, engineering background. Another thing my family had forgotten about their technologically challenged mother. Before marriage and children, I had earned a degree in electrical engineering from Iowa State, graduating summa cum laude in 1981. I had worked for 3 years at a telecommunications company before Robert and I decided I should stay home with the children. 35 years later, that technical foundation proved invaluable in understanding the digital revolution that was transforming every industry. But my family only remembered the mother who had driven carpool and attended PTA meetings. They had no context for the young woman who had designed circuit boards and debugged complex systems. In their minds, I had always been exactly what I appeared to be in my domestic years: loving, supportive, and fundamentally non-technical. The beauty of being underestimated, I discovered, was the freedom it provided. No one questioned my activities because no one imagined I was capable of anything significant. When packages arrived from investment firms or technology companies, my children assumed they were marketing materials targeting elderly people. When I spent hours on my computer, they figured I was playing solitaire or reading recipes online. This invisibility became my greatest asset. I could research investments without scrutiny, make trades without interference, and build wealth without the well-meaning but limiting advice of family members who thought they knew what was best for me. By the 5th year after Robert's death, my portfolio had grown to over $10 million. I had successfully invested in 3 startups that were acquired by major corporations, doubling and tripling my initial investments. My cryptocurrency holdings had increased 20-fold. My real estate investments were generating steady passive income from properties across 4 states. Still, my family saw only what they expected to see. When Sarah complained about her credit card debt, I gently offered to help with a small loan, which she accepted gratefully while explaining that I probably didn't understand how expensive modern life had become. When Marcus worried about his adjustable-rate mortgage, I suggested he might want to consider refinancing, advice he dismissed because real estate is complicated, Mom, not like the simple finances you're used to. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. They would accept my help when it benefited them but dismiss my knowledge when it challenged their assumptions. I was simultaneously wise enough to trust with their problems but too simple to understand the solutions I offered. As my wealth grew, so did the complexity of managing it. I established multiple LLCs, opened accounts with international brokerage firms, and began working with tax professionals who specialized in high-net-worth individuals. I purchased real estate through blind trusts, invested in private equity funds, and even acquired partial ownership in several small technology companies. The paperwork alone would have overwhelmed the simple widow my family imagined me to be. But I thrived on the complexity, energized by the intellectual challenge of optimizing tax strategies, diversifying across asset classes, and staying ahead of market trends. This was the most engaging work I had ever done, more stimulating than any job or hobby I had pursued during my married years. And through it all, I maintained the careful facade of technological incompetence that kept my family comfortable in their assumptions. I asked David to help me update my Facebook profile while simultaneously managing a portfolio of social media stock investments worth millions. I let Sarah explain how online shopping worked while I executed complex foreign exchange trades on my phone. I pretended to struggle with my smart TV remote while monitoring real-time market data from exchanges in Tokyo, London, and New York. The performance became so natural that sometimes I almost forgot it was a performance. When I genuinely couldn't figure out a new app or struggled with an unfamiliar interface, my children's patient explanations felt both insulting and endearing. They truly wanted to help their poor, confused mother navigate the modern world. They just had no idea that their mother was navigating circles around them. There were moments when I considered revealing the truth. When David launched his third failed business venture and asked for another loan, I wanted to tell him that I could fund his dreams 100 times over if he would just listen to some basic business advice. When Sarah stressed about her student loans, I could have paid them off without affecting my investment strategy. When Marcus worried about college funds for his children, I could have assured him that his kids' education was already secured. But something held me back. Perhaps it was pride, the satisfaction of proving that they had underestimated me so completely. Perhaps it was strategy, the knowledge that revealing my success would change our family dynamics in unpredictable ways. Or perhaps it was simply the joy of having something that was entirely mine, a secret identity that existed beyond their expectations and limitations. Whatever the reason, I continued the charade, playing the role of the sweet but simple widow while building something extraordinary beneath their notice. My wealth grew from tens of millions to hundreds of millions, diversified across every major asset class and geographic region. I owned pieces of companies that were shaping the future, held currencies that existed only in digital form, and controlled real estate in cities my family had never heard of. The night that changed everything started like any other. I was reviewing my quarterly portfolio performance, pleased to see that my total assets had officially crossed the $300 million threshold for the first time. It was a milestone I had been working toward for years, a number that represented not just financial success but validation of every assumption my family had made about my capabilities. $300 million. Managed entirely by a woman. They considered too old and too simple to understand how modern life worked. I saved my spreadsheets, closed my laptop, and went to bed with a smile on my face, unaware that within 24 hours, my carefully constructed double life would begin to unravel in ways I never could have predicted. The phone call that would shatter my secret would come from an unexpected source, triggering a chain of events that would force me to choose between the comfortable fiction I had maintained and the extraordinary truth I had been hiding. But that night, I simply went to sleep as Myrtle Jackson, secret millionaire, dreaming of tomorrow's investment opportunities while my family slept peacefully, secure in their conviction that they understood exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The morning that would change everything began unremarkably. I woke at 6:30, as I had for decades, and started my coffee while checking overnight market activity on my phone. The Asian markets had closed higher, European exchanges were showing modest gains, and my overnight cryptocurrency trades had executed successfully. It was shaping up to be a profitable day, nothing unusual in that regard. I was reviewing my calendar, noting that I had a video conference with a startup founder in Silicon Valley later that afternoon, when my landline rang. The landline was something my family insisted I keep for emergencies, though the only people who ever called it were telemarketers and the occasional wrong number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Mrs. Jackson? This is Jennifer Chen from Midwest Financial Planning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm calling to follow up on your recent inquiry about our wealth management services. I froze. I had never contacted Midwest Financial Planning. I did all my wealth management through a discreet firm in Chicago that specialized in high net worth clients who valued privacy. Someone had either made a mistake or was attempting some kind of sophisticated scam. I think you have the wrong person, I said carefully. I haven't made any inquiries. Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer said, sounding genuinely confused. Let me double-check my notes. I have a Myrtle Jackson at this address, referred by David Jackson? He said his mother might be interested in our services for managing a significant inheritance? My blood ran cold. David had somehow found out about my wealth and was shopping around for financial advisors without my knowledge. But how? I had been so careful, so meticulous about maintaining separation between my public persona and my private investments. Every account was in different names, every communication went to a post office box in the next town, every meeting was conducted remotely or in locations far from Cedar Rapids. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding," I told Jennifer. "I'm not interested in your services." "Of course, I understand. But if I could just clarify one thing, David mentioned that you've been successfully managing investments for several years but might benefit from professional oversight. Given the size of your portfolio, he seemed quite knowledgeable about your holdings, particularly your cryptocurrency investments. Is that accurate?" I hung up without answering. My hands were shaking as I set down the phone. How much did David know? How had he found out? And, more importantly, who else had he told? I spent the next hour frantically reviewing my security protocols, checking every account, every communication, every possible point of exposure. Everything appeared normal from a digital perspective. My online activities were protected by VPNs, my accounts were secured with multi-factor authentication, and my trading platforms showed no signs of unauthorized access. But David knew something. The question was how much and how he had discovered it. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. At 9:15, my phone rang again. This time it was David himself. "Mom, hey, I was wondering if we could talk. Are you free for lunch today?" There was something different in his voice, a forced casualness that immediately put me on alert. David never called to schedule lunch. Our interactions were typically limited to family gatherings and the occasional request for financial help. With his latest business venture, "What did you want to talk about?" I asked, trying to keep my own voice neutral. "Oh, just some family stuff. Maybe some financial planning. I've been thinking about your future, making sure you're set up properly for retirement." Financial planning. The same phrase Jennifer Chen had used. This was not a coincidence. "I'm fine, David. I don't need any financial planning." "Mom, come on. I know you think you're doing okay, but things are different now than when Dad was alive. The world is more complicated. There are opportunities you might not even know about, and risks you might not be considering." The condescension in his voice was familiar, but now it carried an additional undertone that made my skin crawl. He knew something, and he was trying to maneuver me into a conversation where he could reveal whatever information he thought he possessed. "What exactly are you talking about, David?" There was a pause. I could almost hear him deciding how much to reveal. "Look, Mom, I know you've been trying to learn about investing, and that's great. But I also know you might be in over your head with some of this stuff. I've heard about elderly people getting scammed with cryptocurrency and complicated financial products they don't understand. I just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of." Elderly people getting scammed. The same dismissive framework that had protected my secret for years was now being weaponized against me. David had discovered something about my investments, but he was interpreting it through the lens of his assumptions about my capabilities. He thought I was a victim, not an architect. "I appreciate your concern," I said slowly, "but I'm not being scammed by anyone." "How can you be sure?" "Some of these schemes are incredibly sophisticated. They target people exactly like you, intelligent, trusting people who might not recognize the warning signs of financial fraud." People exactly like me. As if being a 63-year-old widow automatically made me vulnerable to deception. As if my age and gender rendered me incapable of making informed decisions about complex financial instruments. "David, I'm not having this conversation over the phone. If you have something specific you want to discuss, you can come over here and we'll talk face to face." "Okay, good. I'll be there in an hour. And Mom? I'm bringing Marcus and Sarah. I think this is something we all need to discuss as a family." He hung up before I could object. A family meeting? About my financial situation? Without my consent? Or input about the agenda? I sat in my kitchen, staring at the phone, feeling the walls of my carefully constructed world beginning to close in around me. Whatever David had discovered, he had shared it with his siblings. In 1 hour, I would be facing all 3 of my children, united in their conviction that they needed to protect their poor, confused mother from her own financial decisions. The irony was breathtaking. They were preparing to stage an intervention to save me from investment strategies that had made me wealthier than any of them could imagine. They were going to explain to me why I couldn't be trusted with my own money, while sitting in a house that I could buy and sell 100 times over without affecting my standard of living. But they didn't know that. To them, I was still the technologically challenged widow who needed help programming her television remote. They had no context for understanding that their mother had become one of the most successful private investors in the Midwest. In their minds, any financial activity beyond a basic savings account was evidence of confusion or exploitation. I had 1 hour to decide how to handle this confrontation. I could continue the charade, play the innocent victim, and allow them to rescue me from investments they couldn't comprehend. Or I could reveal the truth and watch their assumptions about me crumble in real time. Neither option was appealing. Maintaining the lie would require surrendering control of my financial future to people who were demonstrably less capable of managing money than I was. But revealing the truth would destroy the family dynamics that had provided me with cover for years, and potentially create new problems I couldn't anticipate. As I waited for my children to arrive, I found myself thinking about Robert and wondering what he would have made of this situation. He had known me better than anyone, had seen glimpses of the analytical mind that I had mostly kept hidden during our marriage. Would he have been proud of what I had accomplished, or would he have joined our children in thinking that I had somehow lost my way? I suspected he would have been proud. Robert had always encouraged my curiosity, even when it led me into areas that seemed inappropriate for a principal's wife. He had supported my decision to audit engineering courses at the community college during the years when our children were in high school. He had bought me my first computer and patiently answered my questions about how various systems worked. If Robert had lived, I might never have needed to develop this expertise. We would have faced retirement together, making conservative decisions that prioritized security over growth. But he hadn't lived, and I had needed to become someone new, someone capable of building the financial security that would allow me to remain independent for the rest of my life. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:15. David was punctual, if nothing else. I opened the door to find all three of my children standing on my porch, wearing expressions of determined concern that immediately confirmed my worst fears about this meeting. "Hi Mom," Sarah said, giving me a hug that felt more like a restraint than an affection. "How are you feeling today?" How was I feeling? As if my financial competence was somehow related to my emotional state. As if making successful investments was a symptom of instability rather than intelligence. "I'm fine," I said, stepping back to let them into the living room. "Though I'm curious about why this conversation requires all three of you to take time off work on a Tuesday morning." They exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that siblings develop when they're planning to gang up on a parent. Marcus, ever the banker, appointed himself spokesman. "Mom, we need to talk about your finances. We're concerned that you might be making some decisions that aren't in your best interest." "What decisions?" I asked, settling into my favorite chair and forcing them to remain standing until they decided to sit down uninvited. "David found some paperwork," Sarah said, perching nervously on the edge of the couch. "Investment statements and cryptocurrency transactions. We're worried that someone might be taking advantage of you." Investment statements. My mind raced through the possibilities. I had been so careful about mail delivery, about digital security, about maintaining separation between my public and private financial lives. How had David gained access to documentation that should have been completely secure? "What paperwork?" I asked. David pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and set it on the coffee table between us. "I found these when I was helping you clean out the basement last month. They were in a box with some of Dad's old papers." The basement. I had asked David to help me reorganize some storage areas, never imagining that he would go through boxes I hadn't specifically identified for his attention. But there it was, my mistake, my one moment of carelessness in years of careful operational security. I opened the folder and immediately recognized the contents. These were printouts from my first year of serious investing, statements and transaction records from when I was still figuring out how to manage the paper trail of complex financial activities. I had thought I had disposed of all physical documentation from that period, but apparently I had missed this collection. The statements showed modest investments in traditional securities, nothing that would indicate the scope of my current portfolio. But they also showed cryptocurrency purchases that would have seemed enormous to my family, and returns that were far too sophisticated for the simple widow they imagined me to be. "These show that you've been investing in Bitcoin and other digital currencies," Marcus said, his banker's training evident in the way he pronounced digital currencies, like a diagnosis of dementia. "Mom, these are extremely volatile investments. They're not appropriate for someone in your situation." "What situation is that?" I asked. "You're on a fixed income," Sarah explained patiently. "You need stability and security, not high risk speculation. These cryptocurrency things are basically gambling." Gambling? $300 million in carefully researched, strategically diversified investments, and my daughter was calling it gambling. "You don't understand what you're looking at," I said. "Mom, that's exactly the problem," David jumped in. "You don't understand what you're looking at either. These investment companies target elderly people specifically because they know you don't have the technical background to recognize when you're being scammed." Technical background. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. They were sitting in the living room of a woman with an electrical engineering degree, talking about her lack of technical background. They were explaining financial concepts to someone whose portfolio outperformed every major index fund, assuming she didn't understand basic economic principles. The moment had come. I could continue playing the role they expected, or I could show them exactly how wrong they were about everything they thought they knew about me. I stood up and walked to my desk, where my laptop sat closed and innocent looking. "Let me show you something," I said, opening it and waiting for the screen to come to life. "Mom, we're not here to play around on the computer," Marcus said impatiently. "We're trying to have a serious conversation about your financial security." "This is about my financial security," I replied, pulling up my primary investment dashboard. "David, you said I don't understand what I'm looking at. Tell me what you think this means." I turned the laptop screen toward them, showing the real-time portfolio summary that I checked every morning. The numbers were larger than anything they had seen in the manila folder, representing holdings across dozens of asset classes and geographic regions. For a moment, nobody spoke. They stared at the screen, trying to process information that didn't match their expectations. I watched their faces as they noticed the account balances, the diversity of holdings, the sophisticated allocation strategies that had produced consistent returns for years. "What is this?" Sarah whispered. "This is my investment portfolio," I said calmly. "The real one, not the beginner's statements you found in the basement." "This can't be right," Marcus said, leaning forward to get a closer look at the numbers. "This shows hundreds of millions of dollars. That has to be some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake. It's the result of 8 years of careful research, strategic investing, and compound growth. Everything you see there represents decisions I made based on analysis I conducted using knowledge I acquired through study and experience." David was shaking his head. "Mom, this doesn't make sense. You can barely use email. How could you possibly manage investments like this?" And there it was. The fundamental assumption that had enabled everything. They couldn't reconcile the evidence in front of them with their image of who I was supposed to be. In their minds, technological competence was binary: either you understood modern systems or you didn't. Either you were capable of complex decision-making, or you needed protection from your own confusion. "I can use email just fine," I said. "I can also execute options trades, analyze blockchain protocols, and evaluate emerging market opportunities. The fact that I sometimes ask for help with my television remote doesn't mean I'm incapable of understanding financial markets." "But how?" Sarah asked. "When did you learn all this? Where did this money come from?" "I learned it the same way anyone learns anything, through study and practice. The money came from your father's life insurance, which I invested instead of letting it sit in a savings account earning 1% interest." I pulled up another screen, showing them the progression of my portfolio value over time. They could see the modest starting point, the gradual acceleration as my knowledge and confidence grew, and the dramatic growth curve that had characterized the last few years. "Every investment you see here represents a decision I made after research and analysis. I didn't get lucky, and I didn't get scammed. I learned how modern financial systems work, and I used that knowledge to build wealth that will secure my independence for the rest of my life." Marcus was studying the portfolio breakdown with the focused attention of someone whose professional expertise was being challenged. "These allocations," he said slowly, "they're actually quite sophisticated. The risk management, the geographic diversification, the sector balance, this is institutional quality investment strategy." "Thank you," I said dryly. "I'm glad my portfolio meets with your professional approval." "But Mom," David interjected, "why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling to understand basic technology? Why did you ask for our help with things you obviously didn't need help with?" That was the question I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Why had I maintained the charade? What had I gained by allowing my own children to underestimate me so completely? "Because you never asked what I was capable of," I said. "You decided what I could and couldn't understand based on your assumptions about my age and background. You treated me like a child who needed protection from the complexities of modern life, so I let you believe that while I quietly built something you never thought I could achieve." "We were trying to help," Sarah said defensively. "You were trying to help the person you thought I was, not the person I actually am. There's a difference." The room fell silent as they processed this information. I could see them struggling to reconcile years of interactions with this new understanding of who I was and what I had been doing while they weren't paying attention. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What happens now? Do you want us to help you manage this? Because honestly, Mom, even if you've been successful so far, an portfolio this size requires professional oversight." "The tax implications alone," Marcus, I interrupted, "I have professional oversight. I work with tax specialists, wealth managers, and legal advisors who understand high net worth portfolio management. I have been handling the tax implications successfully for years. You have advisors? David asked. Of course I have advisors. Did you think I was making $300 million investment decisions in complete isolation? Another silence. Another recalibration of their assumptions. About my capabilities and resources. We feel pretty stupid right now, Sarah said finally. You shouldn't feel stupid, I replied. You should feel curious. For 8 years, you've been explaining to me how the modern world works while I was actively participating in aspects of it that you've never encountered. Maybe the question isn't whether I understand modern life. Maybe the question is whether you understand it as well as you think you do. The conversation that followed lasted for 3 hours. They asked questions about my investment strategies, my research methods, my professional relationships. They wanted to understand how I had acquired the knowledge to make sophisticated financial decisions, how I had maintained operational security for so many years, and why I had never trusted them with the truth about my activities. I answered their questions honestly, showing them my research databases, my communication systems, my analytical tools. I walked them through investment decisions, explained my risk management philosophy, and demonstrated the technical skills they had assumed I didn't possess. Gradually, their shock gave way to something approaching respect. Marcus admitted that my portfolio performance exceeded anything his bank's investment division had achieved. Sarah acknowledged that my cryptocurrency investments had generated returns that made her own retirement planning look conservative to the point of timidity. David confessed that his assumptions about my technological competence had been completely wrong. But respect wasn't the same as understanding, and understanding wasn't the same as acceptance. Even as they admired my financial success, I could see them struggling with the implications of having been so fundamentally wrong about someone they thought they knew completely. The hardest part was explaining why I had hidden my success from them. How could I make them understand that their assumption of my incompetence had been both insulting and liberating? That their condescension had provided me with the invisibility I needed to build something extraordinary? I'm proud of what you've accomplished, David said as they prepared to leave. But I'm also confused about why you felt like you couldn't share it with us. We're your family. We want what's best for you. You wanted what you thought was best. For the person you thought I was, I corrected. That's different from wanting what's actually best for the person I actually am. As I watched them drive away, I realized that everything had changed and nothing had changed. They now knew about my wealth, but they still didn't truly understand the person who had created it. They respected my financial success, but they were still puzzled by the methods I had used to achieve it. They acknowledged their mistakes, but they hadn't fundamentally questioned the assumptions that had led to those mistakes. The secret was out, but the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks that followed the revelation felt like living in a house made of glass. Every conversation with my children carried an undercurrent of bewilderment, as if they were still trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit together in their minds. They would call more frequently now, ostensibly to check on me, but I could hear the real questions lurking beneath their casual inquiries about my health and daily activities. Sarah started asking pointed questions about my computer time, wondering aloud whether I might be spending too many hours staring at screens. Marcus began dropping hints about the importance of professional money management and the risks of going it alone in complex financial markets. David, perhaps feeling the most foolish about his failed intervention, oscillated between awkward attempts at technical conversations and defensive justifications for why he had felt compelled to involve his siblings in my private affairs. What none of them understood was that their newfound awareness of my capabilities had created a different kind of problem. Before, I had been invisible because they assumed I was irrelevant. Now I was visible in ways that made me vulnerable to their good intentions and professional aspirations. The first sign of trouble came from Marcus. 3 weeks after our confrontation, he arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing his most serious banker expression. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table without being invited. "I've talked to some colleagues about your situation, and we think there might be some opportunities to optimize your portfolio management." My blood pressure spiked at the word colleagues. Marcus had been discussing my financial situation with people at his bank. People I had never met, never authorized to know anything about my personal affairs, were now aware that Myrtle Jackson from Cedar Rapids had somehow accumulated significant wealth. "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Well, for starters, you're probably not getting the best possible rates on your cash positions. We can offer you private banking services that would significantly improve your liquidity management. And frankly, Mom, some of your investment choices are more aggressive than they need to be for someone in your position." Someone in my position. The phrase that had justified 8 years of condescension was now being applied to my investment strategy. Apparently, my age and gender still disqualified me from making my own financial decisions, even when those decisions had generated returns that exceeded professional benchmarks. Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm satisfied with my current arrangements. Are you, though? I mean, really satisfied, or just comfortable with what you know? There's a difference between making money in a good market and having a sustainable long-term strategy. The implication stung because it was so predictably patronizing. Marcus was suggesting that my success had been accidental, a product of favorable market conditions rather than skill and knowledge. He was offering to save me from my own good fortune by applying professional oversight to investments that had outperformed his bank's managed portfolios for years. What specifically do you think I'm doing wrong? I asked. Marcus opened his portfolio and pulled out a printed analysis that made my stomach clench. Somehow, he had obtained detailed information about my holdings and had run them through his bank's risk assessment algorithms. The report criticized my cryptocurrency allocations as speculative, my emerging market positions as unsuitable for risk-averse investors, and my startup investments as illiquid and unpredictable. Where did you get this information? I demanded. David gave me the account numbers from those statements he found. I ran a preliminary analysis based on the holdings data you showed us. Mom, I'm not trying to interfere with your independence, but some of these positions represent serious exposure to market volatility. David had given him my account numbers. My own son had shared confidential financial information with his brother's employer without my permission. The violation of trust was breathtaking, but more concerning was the implication that my family now felt entitled to monitor and critique my investment decisions. Marcus, you had no right to analyze my accounts without my permission. And David had no right to share information that doesn't belong to him. We're your family, Mom. We're concerned about your financial security. These cryptocurrency investments alone represent tens of millions of dollars in assets that could disappear overnight if the market crashes. And they represent tens of millions of dollars in assets that didn't exist 8 years ago when I started with a $200,000 life insurance payout. The market has crashed several times since then, and my overall portfolio has continued to grow because I understand diversification and risk management. But for how long? Mom, you're 63 years old. You should be focused on capital preservation, not wealth accumulation. At your age, a significant market downturn could devastate your retirement security. At my age. There it was again, the assumption that reaching a certain number of birthdays automatically disqualified me from making informed decisions about my own money. Marcus was sitting in my kitchen, explaining to me why I shouldn't be trusted with the wealth I had created, using analysis based on information he had obtained without my consent. Marcus, I want you to leave. Mom, please don't be angry. I'm trying to help. You're trying to help by violating my privacy, questioning my competence, and undermining my financial independence. That's not help, that's control. He gathered his papers with the wounded expression of someone who couldn't understand why his good intentions weren't being appreciated. I just think you should consider working with professionals who have experience managing portfolios this size. I am working with professionals. I've been working with professionals for years. The difference is that I chose them based on their qualifications and track record, not because they happened to be related to me. After Marcus left, I spent the afternoon implementing new security measures. I changed passwords, updated access protocols, and moved several accounts to institutions that specialized in privacy protection for high-net-worth clients. I also called my attorney to discuss legal options for preventing family members from accessing information about my financial affairs without authorization. But the damage was already spreading. Within days, I received calls from 2 other banks and an investment firm, all claiming that family members had suggested I might be interested in their wealth management services. The financial services industry in a town the size of Cedar Rapids was small and interconnected, and word was clearly circulating that Myrtle Jackson had somehow accumulated significant assets that might be available for professional management. The attention was exactly what I had spent years avoiding. I had built my wealth in obscurity, using the invisibility that came with being an underestimated elderly widow. Now that invisibility was gone, replaced by the kind of scrutiny that came with being identified as a potential client for high-end financial services. Sarah's approach was more subtle but equally problematic. Instead of challenging my investment strategies directly, she began expressing concerns about my isolation and lack of social support. She worried that I was spending too much time alone with my computers, that I wasn't getting enough human interaction, that my focus on financial matters might be symptomatic of underlying anxiety or depression. Mom, when was the last time you went out with friends? She asked during one of her increasingly frequent visits. When was the last time you did something just for fun, not related to money or investments? The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that still shaped her perception of my activities. Sarah saw my investment work as a burden I had taken on reluctantly, a necessary evil that was consuming too much of my time and energy. She couldn't conceive that I might actually enjoy the intellectual challenge of analyzing markets, evaluating opportunities, and making strategic decisions about complex financial instruments. I enjoy what I do, Sarah. Managing investments isn't a chore for me, it's engaging and rewarding work. But it's not really work, is it? I mean, you're retired. You should be relaxing, traveling, pursuing hobbies. All this financial stress can't be good for your health. Financial stress. As if successfully building a $300 million portfolio was somehow stressful rather than satisfying. As if the intellectual stimulation of navigating global markets was a burden rather than a privilege. I'm not stressed about my finances, Sarah. I'm energized by them. This is the most interesting and challenging work I've ever done. But don't you think you might be becoming a little obsessive about it? David mentioned that you're online at all hours, checking accounts and making trades. That doesn't sound like healthy retirement behavior. David had been monitoring my online activity. Somehow, my children had appointed themselves guardians of my mental health, using my financial success as evidence of psychological instability. In their minds, normal elderly people didn't engage with complex investment strategies, so my engagement must be abnormal. The intervention came on a Tuesday evening in November. I was reviewing quarterly reports from 3 startups in my portfolio when I heard multiple car doors slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw all 3 of my children walking toward my front door, along with 2 people I didn't recognize. I opened the door to find my family accompanied by a middle-aged woman in a business suit and an older man carrying a medical bag. "Mom, we need to talk," David said. "This is Dr. Patricia Kemp from the Geriatric Psychiatry Unit at the hospital. And this is Dr. Raymond Foster, a financial psychologist who specializes in elderly investment behavior. A geriatric psychiatrist and a financial psychologist." My children had arranged a professional evaluation of my mental competence, apparently convinced that my investment success was evidence of cognitive decline or psychological disorder. "I'm not letting strangers into my house to evaluate my mental health," I said firmly. "Mrs. Jackson," Dr. Kemp said in the carefully modulated tone that medical professionals use with potentially unstable patients, "your family is concerned about some recent changes in your behavior. We're just here to have a conversation, to help everyone understand what's going on. What's going on is that my children have decided that my financial success is evidence of mental illness. There's nothing wrong with my behavior, and there's nothing wrong with my judgment." "Mom, please," Sarah interjected. "We're not saying there's anything wrong with you. We're just concerned that you might be taking on more stress than you need to at this stage of your life. And we're concerned about some of the risk factors associated with elderly individuals who become heavily involved in high-stakes financial activities," Dr. Foster added. "Sometimes, investment behavior that appears successful in the short term can mask underlying issues with impulse control or reality testing." Reality testing. They were suggesting that my ability to distinguish between sound investment opportunities and delusional fantasies was compromised. They were proposing to evaluate my mental competence based on the assumption that elderly people who made aggressive investment decisions were, by definition, exhibiting signs of cognitive impairment. "I'm not having this conversation," I said. "You can all leave now." "Mrs. Jackson," Dr. Kemp persisted, "refusing to discuss concerns about your well-being could itself be a sign that you're not thinking clearly about your situation." It was a perfect catch, 22. Agreeing to the evaluation would validate their assumption that my mental state needed professional assessment. Refusing the evaluation would be interpreted as evidence that I lacked insight into my own psychological condition. Either way, my family would have justification for pursuing more intrusive interventions. "Get off my property," I said, stepping back and preparing to close the door. "Mom, we're not trying to hurt you," Marcus said desperately. "We're trying to protect you. What if you're wrong about these investments? What if you lose everything? What if people are taking advantage of you and you can't see it because you're too emotionally invested in believing you're successful? What if you're wrong about me?" I countered. "What if I'm exactly as competent and successful as I appear to be? What if your assumptions about elderly people and financial capability are prejudiced and uninformed?" Dr. Foster pulled out a tablet and began making notes. "Mrs. Jackson, can you tell me how much time you spend each day monitoring your investment accounts? I'm not answering questions from someone I didn't invite into my life. Are you?" Aware that excessive preoccupation with financial markets can be a symptom of anxiety disorders or manic episodes? Are you aware that successful portfolio management requires regular attention and analysis? Are you aware that professional fund managers spend their entire careers monitoring markets and making investment decisions? But you're not a professional fund manager, Mrs. Jackson. You're a retired widow whose family is concerned about your psychological well-being. And there it was, the core assumption that invalidated everything I had accomplished. I wasn't a professional, so my professional level success must be accidental or symptomatic. I was a retired widow, so any behavior that deviated from their expectations of how retired widows should behave was evidence of instability. I closed the door and locked it, leaving them standing on my porch. Through the window, I watched them huddle in urgent conversation before finally departing. But I knew this wasn't over. If anything, my refusal to cooperate with their evaluation would be interpreted as confirmation that more dramatic interventions were necessary. That night, I called my attorney, Elizabeth Hartman, who had been helping me structure my investments and estate planning for the past 3 years. Elizabeth was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my financial situation and had never questioned my competence or judgment. "Myrtle, I'm sorry to hear about this situation with your family," she said after I explained what had happened. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for adult children to seek guardianship or conservatorship when elderly parents accumulate significant wealth through unconventional means. Guardianship, conservatorship, legal mechanisms that would strip me of control over my own financial affairs and transfer decision-making authority to family members who had consistently demonstrated their inability to understand either my capabilities or my strategies. What can I do to protect myself? First, we need to document your mental competence through independent psychological evaluation. I can recommend professionals who specialize in capacity assessments for high-functioning elderly individuals. Second, we should consider establishing additional legal structures that would make it more difficult for family members to challenge your autonomy. What kind of structures? Irrevocable trusts, limited liability companies with complex ownership arrangements, international banking relationships that would be difficult to unwind through domestic legal proceedings. Essentially, we want to make your wealth structure so sophisticated that any attempt to take control would require legal expertise that your family probably doesn't possess. The irony was overwhelming. To protect my right to manage my own money, I needed to make my financial affairs so complex that only highly qualified professionals could understand them. I needed to prove my competence by demonstrating capabilities that went far beyond what most people, including my children, could comprehend. Over the following weeks, I implemented Elizabeth's recommendations. I underwent comprehensive psychological testing that confirmed my cognitive abilities were well above average for my age group. I restructured my investments through a network of legal entities that would require court orders and extensive litigation to modify. I moved significant assets to offshore accounts that would be protected from domestic legal challenges. But, even as I was securing my financial independence, I was losing something else, the possibility of normal family relationships. My children's concern had metastasized into suspicion, and their suspicion had hardened into conviction that I was either mentally impaired or being manipulated by people who were taking advantage of my confusion. They stopped visiting regularly, but I knew they were monitoring me in other ways. Neighbors mentioned that David had asked them to call if they noticed anything unusual about my behavior. Sarah had somehow convinced my primary care physician to flag any prescription changes that might indicate cognitive decline. Marcus was clearly tracking my financial activities through banking industry connections, watching for signs of erratic investment decisions. I had become a person of interest in my own life, subjected to surveillance by people who claimed to love me but couldn't accept the evidence of my capabilities. My success had made me suspect, my independence had made me a target, and my refusal to conform to their expectations had made me an adversary. The breaking point came in December, when I received a formal letter from an attorney representing my 3 children. They were petitioning the court for an emergency conservatorship, claiming that I was suffering from diminished capacity that made me vulnerable to financial exploitation and impaired judgment regarding significant monetary decisions. The petition cited my excessive preoccupation with investment activities, my social isolation from family and friends, my resistance to professional financial advice, and my refusal to cooperate with mental health evaluations. It described my investment portfolio as extremely risky and characterized my returns as unsustainable and indicative of speculative behavior inconsistent with sound retirement planning. In other words, they were asking a judge to declare me mentally incompetent because I had been too successful at managing my own money. The legal battle that followed would test everything I had learned about strategy, patience, and the careful application of superior resources. My children thought they were protecting a confused elderly woman from her own poor judgment. They had no idea they were about to discover exactly how formidable that elderly woman could be when her independence was threatened by people who persistently underestimated her capabilities. The first hearing was scheduled for January 15, less than a month away. I had 4 weeks to prepare a defense that would not only preserve my autonomy but also demonstrate to a court system that routinely sided with concerned family members that their concerns were based on prejudice rather than evidence. It was time to show everyone exactly what Myrtle Jackson was capable of when she stopped pretending to be less than she was. Elizabeth Hartman's law office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Cedar Rapids, a detail that had initially surprised me when I first sought her services 3 years earlier. I had expected a traditional corporate environment, all glass and steel and intimidating leather furniture. Instead, Elizabeth worked from a space that felt more like an elegant library, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, Persian rugs, and the kind of antique desk that suggested both tradition and substance. Now, sitting across from that desk with the conservatorship petition spread between us, I appreciated the environment's suggestion of permanence and stability. This was not a place where hasty decisions were made or where established principles were easily overturned. This was where careful strategies were developed and executed with precision. The petition is more comprehensive than I initially expected, Elizabeth said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the document for the 3rd time. Your children have clearly been planning this for weeks, possibly months. They've documented incidents, gathered statements from witnesses, and constructed a narrative that portrays your investment activities as evidence of cognitive decline. I picked up the petition and read through it again, trying to view it objectively rather than as a personal attack. The language was carefully crafted to sound clinical and concerned rather than accusatory. My children weren't portrayed as greedy or controlling, but as loving family members who had noticed disturbing changes in their mother's behavior and judgment. According to the document, I had become increasingly isolated from family and social connections, obsessively preoccupied with financial markets, and resistant to reasonable advice from qualified professionals. My investment strategies were characterized as extremely high risk and inappropriate for an elderly individual on a fixed income. My refusal to cooperate with psychiatric evaluation was presented as evidence that I lacked insight into my own diminished capacity. Most damaging was a section that detailed specific investment decisions, describing my cryptocurrency holdings as speculative gambling, my startup investments as naive participation in schemes targeting elderly victims, and my international holdings as complex financial arrangements that suggest impaired judgment regarding risk assessment. They've essentially argued that your success is proof of your incompetence, Elizabeth observed. The logic is that no reasonable person your age would make these kinds of investments, so the fact that you made them and they happened to work out must mean you got lucky while exercising poor judgment. What's our strongest defense? I asked. Documentation. We need to demonstrate that every investment decision you've made was based on research, analysis, and expertise. We need to show that your portfolio performance isn't accidental, but the result of knowledge and skill that most professional managers would envy. Elizabeth opened a thick folder that contained financial records, correspondence, and analysis reports that I had been accumulating for years. Fortunately, you've been meticulous about maintaining records. We can trace the intellectual foundation for every major investment decision you've made. We can show the court exactly how you acquired the knowledge necessary to make these choices. And we can demonstrate that your results are consistent with sophisticated investment strategy rather than random speculation. She pulled out a timeline that her staff had prepared, showing the progression of my investment education alongside the growth of my portfolio. This tells a clear story of deliberate skill development. You didn't wake up one morning and start throwing money at cryptocurrencies. You spent months studying blockchain technology, reading white papers, analyzing market trends, and starting with small, carefully considered investments. The timeline was impressive even to me, seeing 8 years of learning and growth laid out in chronological order. Each major investment decision was accompanied by documentation showing the research that had informed it, the risk assessment that had guided the allocation, and the monitoring that had enabled strategic adjustments over time. The psychological evaluation will be crucial, Elizabeth continued. Dr. Margaret Chen is one of the most respected neuropsychologists in the state, and she specializes in capacity assessments for high-functioning elderly individuals. Her evaluation will carry significant weight with the court. Dr. Chen's report had been completed the previous week, and the results were unambiguous. My cognitive abilities tested in the 97th percentile for my age group. My memory reasoning skills, and executive function all scored well above average. Most importantly, the assessment found no evidence of impaired judgment, diminished capacity, or cognitive decline that would justify external oversight of my financial decisions. But the strongest element of our defense, Elizabeth said, will be expert testimony about your investment performance. I've arranged for Dr. James Morrison from the University of Chicago to review your portfolio and provide professional analysis of your strategies and results. Dr. Morrison was a professor of finance who had spent 30 years studying investment performance and portfolio management. His preliminary review of my holdings had been remarkably positive, describing my asset allocation as sophisticated, my risk management as exemplary, and my overall performance as superior to most institutional investors. Morrison will testify that your investment decisions demonstrate advanced knowledge of financial markets and exceptional skill in portfolio construction, Elizabeth explained. He'll explain to the court that the strategies your children characterize as reckless are actually quite conservative when viewed in the context of modern portfolio theory. As we prepared for the hearing, I found myself thinking about the fundamental question that the court would need to answer: what constituted normal behavior for a woman in my situation? My children were arguing that my investment activities were so far outside the range of typical elderly behavior that they must be evidence of mental impairment. Our response would be that my activities were only unusual because most people my age didn't have access to the education, resources, and opportunities that had enabled my success. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in January, and the courthouse was everything I had expected: imposing stone architecture, high ceilings, and the kind of formal atmosphere that made every conversation feel like a deposition. I arrived early, wearing my most conservative business suit and carrying a briefcase that contained 8 years of financial records organized into color-coded sections. Judge Patricia Williams was a woman in her 50s who had built her career on family law and guardianship cases. According to Elizabeth's research, she was generally sympathetic to family concerns about elderly welfare but also respectful of individual autonomy when competence could be clearly demonstrated. My children sat at the opposing table with their attorney, a sharp-faced man named Kenneth Ross who specialized in conservatorship proceedings. They avoided eye contact with me, maintaining the careful distance of people who had convinced themselves that their betrayal was actually an act of love. The opening statements laid out the fundamental disagreement that had brought us to court. Ross argued that I was a vulnerable elderly woman whose judgment had been compromised by age-related cognitive changes, making me susceptible to financial exploitation and poor decision-making. He portrayed my family as reluctant but responsible guardians who had observed concerning changes in my behavior and sought court intervention only after I refused to accept reasonable assistance. Elizabeth's opening statement took a different approach. She acknowledged that my investment activities were unusual for someone my age and background, but argued that unusual did not mean incompetent. She promised to show the court that my financial success was the result of deliberate skill development and sophisticated analysis, not luck or manipulation. The first witness was Dr. Foster, the financial psychologist who had accompanied my family to my house. His testimony was polished and persuasive, describing the psychological factors that made elderly individuals vulnerable to financial exploitation and poor investment decisions. Advanced age is associated with decreased cognitive flexibility and increased susceptibility to emotional decision-making, he explained to the court. Elderly individuals often become preoccupied with financial security, leading them to make increasingly risky investment decisions in pursuit of unrealistic returns. Ross walked Dr. Foster through a theoretical framework that painted my investment behavior as textbook evidence of age-related cognitive decline. According to his analysis, my focus on high-growth investments represented unrealistic optimism, my resistance to family advice indicated decreased social judgment, and my complex portfolio structure suggested impaired ability to assess and manage risk. In your professional opinion, Ross asked, are Mrs. Jackson's investment activities consistent with normal aging and sound financial judgment? No, they are not. The pattern of behavior described by her family members suggests an elderly individual whose judgment has been compromised by cognitive changes that she may not be able to recognize herself. Elizabeth's cross-examination focused on Dr. Foster's lack of direct knowledge about my situation. He had never examined me personally, never reviewed my investment research, and never analyzed my actual portfolio performance. His testimony was based entirely on second-hand descriptions provided by my family and theoretical assumptions about elderly investment behavior. Dr. Foster, are you familiar with Mrs. Jackson's educational background? I understand that she was a homemaker for most of her adult life. Are you aware that she holds a degree in electrical engineering from Iowa State University? No, I was not aware of that. Are you familiar with the research process that Mrs. Jackson used to make her investment decisions? I was told that she spent excessive amounts of time on computers, which can be a sign of social isolation and obsessive behavior in elderly individuals. But you don't actually know what she was doing during that computer time, do you? No, I do not. Elizabeth continued this line of questioning, demonstrating that Dr. Foster's entire analysis was based on incomplete information and stereotypical assumptions about elderly behavior. By the time she finished, his expert opinion looked more like professional prejudice than scientific assessment. The next witness was Marcus, who testified about his discovery of my investment activities and his subsequent concerns about my financial judgment. His testimony was emotional and seemed genuinely heartfelt, describing his shock at learning about my portfolio and his worry that I was taking on risks that could jeopardize my financial security. My mother has always been conservative with money, he told the court. She clipped coupons, shopped sales, and saved every penny. The idea that she would suddenly start investing in cryptocurrencies and startup companies was completely out of character. Ross guided Marcus through a description of my investment holdings, emphasizing the volatile nature of cryptocurrency markets and the failure rate of startup companies. He painted a picture of an elderly woman who had abandoned a lifetime of financial caution in favor of speculative investments she couldn't possibly understand. In your professional opinion as a banker, Ross asked, are these appropriate investments for someone in your mother's situation? Absolutely not. These are the kinds of high-risk investments that we would discourage for any client, but especially for elderly clients who need to focus on capital preservation rather than wealth accumulation. Elizabeth's cross-examination revealed the limitations of Marcus's professional expertise and the self-interest that motivated his concerns. She established that his bank's investment division had significantly underperformed my portfolio, that his recommendations would have cost me millions in potential returns, and that his analysis of my risk exposure was based on outdated assumptions about appropriate asset allocation for elderly investors. Marcus, you testified that your mother's investments are inappropriate for someone in her situation. What exactly do you mean by her situation? She's a 63-year-old widow on a fixed income. She needs stable, predictable returns, not volatile investments that could lose value. Are you aware that your mother's portfolio has generated average annual returns of over 20% for the past 8 years? Yes, but past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Are you aware that your bank's managed portfolios have averaged less than 8% annual returns during the same period? Our portfolios prioritize capital preservation over aggressive growth. So your professional recommendation would have cost your mother approximately $150 million in potential returns over the past 8 years? Marcus struggled to answer this question without acknowledging that his conservative approach would have dramatically reduced my wealth accumulation. Elizabeth pressed the point, demonstrating that the appropriate investment strategy he advocated would have left me significantly less financially secure than the inappropriate strategy one had actually pursued. Sarah's testimony focused on my psychological state and social behavior. She described me as increasingly isolated, obsessively focused on financial matters, and resistant to family input or professional advice. According to her account, my investment activities had consumed my life to the extent that I no longer engaged in normal social activities or maintained healthy relationships. She used to be so social, Sarah told the court. She volunteered at church, had friends over for dinner, enjoyed hobbies like gardening and reading. Now she spends all her time staring at computer screens, checking account balances, and making trades. It's like she's become addicted to the excitement of making money. Ross used Sarah's testimony to paint a picture of social isolation and obsessive behavior that supported the theory of age-related cognitive decline. According to their narrative, my investment success had actually harmed my overall well-being by replacing healthy social engagement with unhealthy financial preoccupation. Elizabeth's cross-examination challenged Sarah's characterization of my current lifestyle and motivations. She established that I had never been particularly social, that my volunteer activities had decreased gradually over several years rather than suddenly after I began investing, and that my focus on financial matters represented intellectual engagement rather than obsessive behavior. Sarah, you testified that your mother has become obsessively focused on financial matters. How many hours per day would you estimate she spends on investment-related activities? I don't know exactly, but she's always on her computer when I visit. Have you ever asked her what she's working on during that computer time? I've tried, but she gives vague answers or changes the subject. Is it possible that she gives vague answers because you've never shown genuine interest in understanding her investment activities? I think she knows that we're concerned about her judgment, so she's become defensive about discussing her finances. Or is it possible that she's learned not to discuss complex subjects with family members who consistently underestimate her capabilities? David's testimony was the most damaging because it focused on specific incidents that seemed to support concerns about my judgment and behavior. He described finding the investment statements in the basement, my evasive responses to questions about my financial activities, and my refusal to cooperate with the psychiatric evaluation they had arranged. She's become secretive and paranoid, David told the court. She acts like we're trying to hurt her when we're just trying to help. She won't listen to professional advice, she won't discuss her financial situation openly, and she gets angry whenever we express concern about her well-being. Ross used David's testimony to establish a pattern of defensive behavior that allegedly indicated lack of insight into my own diminished capacity. According to their theory, my resistance to family intervention was itself evidence that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about my own welfare. Elizabeth's cross-examination focused on David's violation of my privacy and the family's failure to respect my autonomy. She established that David had shared confidential financial information without my permission, that the family had attempted to involve medical professionals without my consent, and that their definition of help consistently involved overriding my own preferences and judgment. David, you testified that your mother has become secretive about her finances. When did she give you permission to share her account information with your brother? She didn't give permission, but we were concerned about her welfare. So you shared confidential financial information without authorization because you disagreed with her investment decisions? We shared information with family members because we thought she might be making mistakes that could hurt her. Did it occur to you that your mother might have legitimate reasons for not wanting to discuss her financial affairs with people who consistently questioned her competence? The family's case concluded with testimony from Dr. Kemp, the geriatric psychiatrist who had accompanied them to my house. Like Dr. Foster, she had never actually examined me, but she offered theoretical observations about elderly behavior patterns and the psychological factors that could impair financial judgment. Her testimony was professional and measured, but it was also based entirely on secondhand information and general assumptions about aging and cognition. Elizabeth's cross-examination exposed the weakness of offering expert opinions without direct examination, and by the time Dr. Kemp left the witness stand, her credibility had been significantly undermined. Our defense began with Dr. Chen, the neuropsychologist who had conducted my capacity assessment. Her testimony was methodical and comprehensive, describing the battery of tests she had administered and the results that demonstrated my cognitive abilities were well above average for my age group. Mrs. Jackson's performance on measures of memory, reasoning, and executive function all scored in the 97th percentile for her age cohort, Dr. Chen explained. Her cognitive abilities are not only intact, they are superior to most individuals in their 60s. Elizabeth walked Dr. Chen through the specific tests that assess decision-making capacity, risk assessment, and judgment. In every category, my performance had exceeded the threshold for demonstrating competence to manage my own financial affairs. In your professional opinion, Elizabeth asked, does Mrs. Jackson demonstrate any signs of cognitive impairment that would affect her ability to make informed financial decisions? None whatsoever. Her cognitive abilities are excellent, and she demonstrates sophisticated understanding of complex financial concepts and risk management principles. Ross's cross-examination focused on the possibility that cognitive decline could occur rapidly and that a single evaluation might not capture changes in mental status over time. Dr. Chen acknowledged these theoretical possibilities but maintained that my current cognitive abilities clearly supported my capacity to manage my own affairs. Dr. Morrison's testimony provided the intellectual foundation for defending my investment strategies. As a professor of finance with decades of experience analyzing portfolio performance, he was uniquely qualified to evaluate whether my investment decisions represented sound financial judgment or reckless speculation. Mrs. Jackson's portfolio demonstrates sophisticated understanding of modern investment principles, he told the court. Her asset allocation strategy, risk management approach, and diversification techniques are consistent with advanced portfolio theory and best practices in wealth management. Elizabeth had Dr. Morrison walk through specific investment decisions, explaining the research and analysis that had informed each choice. He demonstrated that my cryptocurrency investments, far from being speculative gambling, represented carefully considered positions in emerging asset classes with significant long-term potential. The cryptocurrency allocation in Mrs. Jackson's portfolio represents approximately 8% of her total holdings, Dr. Morrison explained. This is consistent with recommendations from major investment firms for high net worth clients seeking exposure to alternative assets. He similarly defended my startup investments, international holdings, and growth-focused strategies, explaining that each component of my portfolio served a specific purpose within an overall framework designed to maximize risk-adjusted returns over long time horizons. Professor Morrison, Elizabeth asked, how would you characterize Mrs. Jackson's investment performance relative to professional benchmarks? Her 8-year track record is exceptional. Her risk-adjusted returns exceed those of most institutional investors, including pension funds, endowments, and professional money managers. Ross's cross-examination attempted to characterize my success as lucky rather than skillful, but Dr. Morrison systematically refuted this interpretation. He explained that consistent outperformance over 8 years could not be attributed to chance, and that the sophistication of my strategies indicated deep understanding of financial markets rather than accidental success. The final witness was Dr. Rebecca Torres, a professor of gerontology who specialized in aging and cognitive function. Her testimony addressed the broader question of what constituted normal behavior for intelligent, educated elderly individuals in the modern economy. The assumption that elderly people should avoid complex financial activities is based on outdated stereotypes rather than current research about aging and cognition, Dr. Torres explained. Many individuals in their 60s and 70s are capable of sophisticated intellectual engagement, including complex financial analysis and investment management. She described research showing that intellectual challenge and mental stimulation were actually beneficial for cognitive health in aging populations, and that activities like investment analysis could help maintain cognitive function rather than indicating its decline. Dr. Torres, Elizabeth asked, is it unusual for an intelligent, educated woman in her 60s to successfully manage a complex investment portfolio? It's uncommon, but only because most people lack the educational background, financial resources, and intellectual curiosity necessary for sophisticated investment management. The rarity of the behavior doesn't make it pathological. Elizabeth's closing argument synthesized the evidence we had presented, emphasizing that my investment success was the result of deliberate skill development rather than luck or manipulation. She argued that the real issue wasn't my competence, but my family's inability to accept that I was more capable than they had assumed. Myrtle Jackson is not a confused elderly woman who needs protection from her own poor judgment, Elizabeth told the court. She is an intelligent, educated, financially sophisticated individual who has built extraordinary wealth through careful research, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution. Her family's petition is based on their own limitations and prejudices, not on any evidence of diminished capacity. Ross's closing argument returned to the theme of age-appropriate behavior and family concern. He argued that regardless of my past success, the risks associated with my investment strategy were inappropriate for someone my age, and that my resistance to family input indicated impaired social judgment that could lead to future financial catastrophe. Mrs. Jackson may have been lucky so far, he told the court, but luck doesn't last forever. Her family has a responsibility to protect her from the consequences of increasingly risky financial behavior, and the court has a responsibility to ensure that elderly citizens are protected from their own diminished judgment. Judge Williams took 2 weeks to render her decision. When the court reconvened, I sat in the same chair where I had listened to my children argue that I was too incompetent to control my own money. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. I was sitting in a courtroom, surrounded by lawyers who charged hundreds of dollars per hour for financial advice, defending my right to manage a portfolio that had outperformed every professional benchmark for 8 consecutive years. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Williams began, the court finds that Mrs. Jackson demonstrates clear capacity to manage her own financial affairs. The evidence shows that her investment decisions are based on research, analysis, and expertise that most professional managers would envy. While her strategies may be unconventional for someone her age, unconventional does not mean incompetent. The judge continued, addressing the broader implications of the case. The court is particularly troubled by the underlying assumption that elderly individuals should be discouraged from intellectual engagement and complex decision-making simply because of their age. Mrs. Jackson's success demonstrates that age alone is not a valid basis for determining financial competence. She denied the petition for conservatorship, but her final comments carried a warning that stayed with me long after I left the courthouse. While the court finds no evidence supporting the need for guardianship in this case, it encourages Mrs. Jackson to consider whether her current approach to family relationships serves her best interests in the long term. Financial success is important, but family relationships are irreplaceable. As I walked out of the courthouse, legally vindicated but emotionally exhausted, I realized that winning the case had been the easy part. The harder challenge would be figuring out how to rebuild relationships with children who had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent because they couldn't accept the evidence of my capabilities. The legal victory had preserved my autonomy, but it had also formalized the fracture in our family that had been growing for months. My children had publicly argued that I was too confused and impaired to manage my own affairs. I had publicly demonstrated that they were wrong about almost everything they thought they knew about me. We were all going home to the same town, but we were no longer living in the same world. The months following the conservatorship hearing felt like living in a town where everyone knew your business but no one understood your story. Cedar Rapids was small enough that word of the court case had spread through the usual channels of gossip and speculation, creating a peculiar kind of local celebrity that I had never sought and didn't particularly enjoy. At the grocery store, cashiers would give me knowing looks and ask how I was managing everything, with a tone that suggested they knew about my financial situation but weren't quite sure what to make of it. At the bank, tellers who had previously treated me with polite indifference now spoke to me with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made routine transactions feel like performance art. Most unsettling was the sudden attention from financial professionals throughout the region. Within weeks of the court decision, I received calls from investment advisors, tax attorneys, estate planners, and wealth management firms, all eager to discuss how they might assist me with my portfolio. The legal proceedings had apparently transformed me from an invisible elderly widow into a high-value prospect for an entire industry built around managing other people's money. Elizabeth Hartman had warned me that this would happen. Court records are public, she had explained. Once word gets out about the size of your portfolio, you're going to attract attention from every financial services professional in Iowa. What she hadn't warned me about was how this attention would affect my relationship with my community. For 8 years, I had been just another retired widow living quietly in a modest house on Elm Street. Now I was the woman who had somehow accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars while everyone assumed she was barely managing on Social Security and pension income. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Neighbors who had previously offered to help with yard work or snow removal now spoke to me with a careful deference that suggested they weren't sure of their standing relative to my newfound status. The pastor at my church, who had known me for 30 years, began including pointed references to stewardship and charitable giving in his sermons, glancing meaningfully in my direction during the portions about using God's blessings to serve others. Even more challenging was navigating these new social dynamics while maintaining the privacy that had enabled my investment success. People wanted to know how I had done it, what my secret was, whether I could help them achieve similar results. I found myself constantly deflecting questions about investment strategies, market predictions, and financial advice that I was neither qualified nor inclined to provide. The irony was that becoming known for my financial expertise had actually made it harder for me to continue practicing it effectively. My morning routine of market analysis and portfolio management now felt exposed and performative, as if the entire town was watching to see what the famous investor would do next. But the most difficult adjustment was the complete silence from my children. In the 6 weeks since the court hearing, none of them had called, visited, or made any attempt to communicate with me. I understood their embarrassment about the failed conservatorship petition, but their absolute withdrawal felt like punishment for having the audacity to prove them wrong. I had won the legal battle to preserve my autonomy, but the cost was the complete destruction of my family relationships. Every morning I woke up in a house that felt larger and quieter than it had before the truth came out, when at least my children's condescension had provided some form of human connection. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On a Thursday evening in March, I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports from 3 companies in my portfolio when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman in her early 30s holding a manila envelope and looking nervous. "Mrs. Jackson? My name is Rachel Morrison. I'm Dr. James Morrison's daughter. He testified for you during your court hearing?" I remembered. Dr. Morrison, the University of Chicago finance professor who had provided expert testimony about my investment strategies. His analysis had been crucial in demonstrating that my portfolio management was sophisticated rather than reckless. "What can I do for you, Rachel? I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. My father suggested that you might be willing to help with a situation I'm facing." I invited her in, curious about what kind of situation would prompt a professor's daughter to seek advice from someone she had never met. Rachel settled nervously on my couch and explained that she was a doctoral student in economics at Northwestern University, writing her dissertation on gender bias in financial services and investment management. My research focuses on how assumptions about women's financial capabilities affect their access to investment opportunities and professional respect, she said. When my father told me about your case, I realized you might be the perfect example of someone who succeeded despite these biases rather than because of institutional support. She opened her envelope and pulled out a thick manuscript. I've been documenting cases where women's financial expertise was overlooked or dismissed because of gender stereotypes. Your story is remarkable because you didn't just overcome these biases, you used them strategically to build wealth while remaining invisible to the systems that typically exclude women from high-level investing. Rachel's research had led her to investigate other cases similar to mine, and she had discovered a pattern of women who had achieved significant investment success while being systematically underestimated by family members, financial professionals, and society in general. There's a woman in Vermont who built a $50 million portfolio while her husband thought she was just playing around with a household budget, Rachel explained. Another in Texas who used life insurance money to become one of the most successful angel investors in the state, while her adult children assumed she was spending her time gardening and watching television. The stories were both inspiring and depressing, illustrating how pervasive assumptions about women's financial capabilities could create opportunities for those smart enough to exploit them while simultaneously limiting recognition and support for female investors. What I'd like to understand, Rachel continued, is how you develop the knowledge and confidence to make investment decisions that professional managers struggle with. And more importantly, how you maintain the discipline to continue investing successfully while dealing with family members who questioned your every move. Her questions were more sophisticated than anything my own children had ever asked about my investment activities. Rachel understood the complexity of what I had accomplished because she had studied the barriers that typically prevented women my age from achieving similar success. The isolation was both a burden and an asset, I explained. Being underestimated meant that no one was watching closely enough to interfere with my decisions, but it also meant that I couldn't seek advice or support when I needed it. How did you handle the learning curve? Most people who start investing in their 50s make significant mistakes because they don't have time to recover from major losses. I started small and treated every loss as a learning opportunity, rather than a failure. I also spent years studying before I made any significant investments. By the time I was managing large amounts of money, I had already made most of the typical beginner mistakes with amounts I could afford to lose. Rachel spent 3 hours interviewing me about my investment philosophy, research methods, and decision-making processes. Her questions helped me articulate aspects of my approach that I had never fully analyzed, and her obvious respect for my expertise was a refreshing change from the skepticism I had encountered from financial professionals who couldn't believe that an elderly widow could outperform institutional investors. Would you be willing to let me write about your case for my dissertation? She asked as she prepared to leave. I would protect your privacy, of course, but your story illustrates several important principles about how gender bias affects investment opportunities. I agreed to participate in her research, partly because I believed in the importance of her work, but mostly because talking to someone who understood and respected my expertise had reminded me how much I missed intellectual engagement about subjects I was passionate about. Rachel's visit had an unexpected side effect. For the first time since the conservatorship hearing, I began to think about the broader implications of my investment success rather than just the personal costs of maintaining it. I had spent 8 years building wealth in isolation, focused entirely on proving to myself that I could succeed despite being underestimated. But what was the point of that success if I couldn't share it or use it to create opportunities for others? The idea that had been forming in the back of my mind began to take shape as a concrete plan. Instead of simply managing my wealth privately, I could use it to address some of the systemic problems that Rachel's research had identified. I could create opportunities for other women to develop investment expertise, support female entrepreneurs who struggled to access traditional funding, and challenge the assumptions that limited women's participation in high-level financial decision-making. The first step was establishing a foundation focused on financial education and investment opportunities for women. I had never been involved in organized philanthropy, but my years of investment research had taught me how to analyze organizations, evaluate management teams, and structure funding to maximize impact. I spent several weeks researching existing foundations and nonprofit organizations that focused on women's financial empowerment. Most were small, underfunded efforts that provided basic budgeting advice and debt counseling. Very few addressed the more complex challenge of helping women develop the knowledge and confidence to become serious investors. The gap in the market was obvious, but filling it would require more than just financial resources. It would require expertise, credibility, and institutional relationships that I didn't possess. I needed partners who understood both the investment world and the nonprofit sector, people who could help translate my resources into effective programs. The solution came through Elizabeth Hartman, who had maintained her role as my attorney and had become something approaching a friend during the months since the conservatorship hearing. Elizabeth had extensive experience with nonprofit law and had helped several wealthy clients establish foundations and charitable organizations. "What you're describing is ambitious," she said when I explained my vision for a foundation focused on women's investment education. "Most philanthropic efforts in this area focus on basic financial literacy. You're talking about creating sophisticated educational programs that could help women become serious investors. Is that a problem? It's a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. The bigger question is whether you're prepared for the level of public engagement that this kind of foundation would require. You've spent 8 years maintaining your privacy. Running a foundation would make you very visible." Elizabeth was right to raise this concern. For nearly a decade, I had carefully avoided attention and maintained separation between my public persona and my private investment activities. Establishing a foundation would require me to become a public advocate for women's financial empowerment, speaking at conferences, meeting with other philanthropists, and generally becoming the kind of visible figure I had spent years avoiding. But the alternative was continuing to live in isolation, managing my wealth privately while doing nothing to address the systemic problems that had shaped my own experience. The conservatorship hearing had already destroyed my anonymity within Cedar Rapids. Perhaps it was time to use that visibility constructively rather than simply enduring it. What would be involved in establishing this kind of foundation? I asked. Legal structure, board of directors, mission statement, program development, staff hiring, and significant ongoing management responsibilities, Elizabeth replied. It's not something you can do part-time while continuing to manage your investment portfolio at the current level of intensity. She was right about the time commitment, but she was also helping me recognize that my priorities had shifted since the court case. For 8 years, I had been focused entirely on building wealth and proving my investment capabilities. Now I was more interested in using that wealth and those capabilities to create opportunities for others. How long would it take to establish the legal framework for a foundation? 6 months, if we move aggressively. But Myrtle, before we start down this path, you need to think carefully about what you're committing to. Once you become known as a philanthropist focused on women's financial issues, you're going to attract attention from advocacy groups, academic researchers, media organizations, and probably some political figures who want to use your story to support various policy initiatives. The prospect of that level of attention was intimidating, but it was also energizing in a way that surprised me. For decades, I had been content to remain in the background, supporting my husband's career and my children's activities while keeping my own ambitions modest and private. The investment success had given me confidence in my analytical abilities, but it had also been a solitary pursuit that didn't require interaction with other people or organizations. Creating a foundation would force me to become a leader and public advocate, roles I had never sought but was increasingly interested in exploring. At 63, I was finally ready to step out of the shadows and use my resources to address problems that extended beyond my own financial security. The planning process took 4 months and involved more complexity than I had anticipated. Elizabeth introduced me to consultants who specialized in foundation management, program development, and nonprofit governance. I interviewed potential board members, reviewed similar organizations across the country, and developed detailed plans for educational programs, investment funds, and research initiatives. The most challenging aspect was defining the foundation's scope and target population. I wanted to focus on women who had the educational background and financial resources to become serious investors but lacked the knowledge, confidence, or institutional access to do so effectively. This was a much smaller population than the broader category of women who needed basic financial literacy, but it was also an underserved market with significant potential for economic impact. After extensive research and consultation, we decided to launch with 3 primary programs. The first was an intensive educational curriculum that would teach women how to analyze investment opportunities, construct diversified portfolios, and manage risk across different asset classes. The second was a seed funding program that would provide capital and mentorship for female entrepreneurs in technology and finance. The third was a research initiative that would document and address barriers to women's participation in high-level investing. The foundation would be called the Morrison Institute for Women's Financial Leadership, named after both Dr. James Morrison, whose expertise had been crucial during my court case, and his daughter Rachel, whose research had inspired my decision to move beyond private wealth management. Establishing the foundation required me to hire staff, rent office space, and begin the kind of public engagement that I had avoided for years. I found myself attending conferences on women's entrepreneurship, meeting with representatives from business schools and investment firms, and giving interviews to financial publications about my investment philosophy and philanthropic goals. The transformation from invisible widow to public advocate was both exhilarating and exhausting. After years of conducting my investment research in private, I was now discussing market strategies and portfolio theory with audiences of hundreds. After decades of avoiding attention, I was being invited to serve on boards and advisory committees for organizations I had only read about in newspapers. But the most rewarding aspect of the foundation work was meeting other women who had achieved investment success despite systemic barriers and institutional skepticism. Through conferences and networking events, I discovered a community of female investors, entrepreneurs, and financial professionals who had been working in relative isolation, building wealth and creating opportunities while being consistently underestimated by the broader financial establishment. These women understood the unique challenges of being taken seriously in investment circles, the extra research required to overcome assumptions about their expertise, and the careful balance between confidence and humility necessary to succeed while female in a male-dominated industry. For the first time since I had begun investing, I was part of a community that appreciated both the difficulty and the significance of what I had accomplished. The Foundation's first educational program launched in September, 6 months after the initial planning began. We accepted 30 women for an intensive 12-week curriculum that covered everything from fundamental analysis to derivatives trading to venture capital evaluation. The participants included doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business executives who had achieved professional success but had never learned how to translate their income into significant wealth through strategic investing. The program was more demanding than most MBA-level finance courses, requiring participants to analyze real investment opportunities, construct actual portfolios, and present their strategies to panels of professional investors. By the end of 12 weeks, these women had developed expertise that many financial advisors lacked, and several had begun making investment decisions that significantly improved their long-term financial prospects. The success of the first program led to immediate demand for expansion. We received applications from women across the Midwest who wanted to participate in future sessions, and several professional organizations asked us to develop specialized curricula for their members. The seed funding program was similarly oversubscribed, with dozens of female entrepreneurs applying for capital and mentorship that traditional venture capital firms had been reluctant to provide. But the most gratifying feedback came from participants who described how the program had changed not just their financial strategies but their entire relationship with money and investing. These were accomplished women who had been successful in demanding careers but had never been taught to think of themselves as potential investors or wealth builders. I spent 20 years assuming that investing was too complicated for me to understand, one participant wrote in her program evaluation. Now I realize that investing is just applied analytical thinking, and I've been doing analytical thinking my entire career. Another participant described how the program had helped her recognize that her conservative approach to money management had actually been a form of financial self-sabotage. I was so afraid of making mistakes that I was guaranteeing mediocre returns. Learning how to assess and manage risk has been more valuable than any other professional development I've ever done. The Foundation's research initiative began documenting the systemic factors that prevented women from accessing high-level investment opportunities. Working with Rachel Morrison and several other graduate students, we conducted surveys and interviews with female investors, financial advisors, and institutional managers to identify the most significant barriers to women's participation in wealth building. The results confirmed what I had suspected based on my own experience. Women were consistently underestimated by financial professionals, excluded from informal networks where investment opportunities were discussed, and discouraged from pursuing aggressive wealth-building strategies because of assumptions about their risk tolerance and financial sophistication. But the research also revealed that women who did succeed as investors often outperformed their male counterparts, particularly in areas requiring patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. The problem wasn't that women were less capable of investment success, but that they were given fewer opportunities to develop and demonstrate their capabilities. As the Foundation's profile grew, I began receiving invitations to speak at major conferences and participate in panels about women's financial empowerment. These public appearances forced me to become comfortable discussing my own investment strategies and the lessons I had learned from 8 years of building wealth while being systematically underestimated. The speaking engagements were initially terrifying for someone who had spent decades avoiding public attention, but they also provided opportunities to reach women who might benefit from understanding that investment success was achievable despite institutional barriers and family skepticism. The most common question I received during these appearances was how I had maintained confidence in my abilities while my own family questioned my judgment. The answer was complicated because it involved acknowledging that I had sometimes doubted myself, particularly during the early years when my investment knowledge was still developing and market volatility tested my commitment to long-term strategies. Self-doubt is inevitable when you're pursuing goals that other people think are inappropriate or impossible, I would tell audiences. The key is distinguishing between productive self-doubt that motivates better research and analysis, and destructive self-doubt that prevents you from acting on good information. I also emphasized that investment success required accepting uncertainty and making decisions based on incomplete information, skills that many women had already developed through other aspects of their lives but hadn't recognized as applicable to financial markets. If you've ever made complex decisions about career changes, family planning, or major purchases, you already have most of the analytical skills necessary for investment success, I would explain. The main difference is that investment decisions involve numbers and terminology that can seem intimidating until you realize they're just tools for organizing information you already know how to evaluate. As the Foundation's first year progressed, I found myself thinking less about my personal investment portfolio and more about the broader impact of the educational and funding programs we had developed. The women who had completed our intensive curriculum were beginning to achieve significant investment returns, and several of the entrepreneurs we had funded were building companies that would create opportunities for other women. But the most meaningful measure of success was the growing network of female investors who had connected through foundation programs and were beginning to support each other's ventures and share investment opportunities. We had created not just educational programs, but a community of women who understood that building wealth was both achievable and important for creating independence and influence. The foundation work had also begun to change my relationship with my own wealth. For 8 years, I had focused primarily on accumulating assets and proving my investment capabilities. Now I was using those assets to create opportunities for others and discovering that the impact of shared success was more satisfying than the achievement of individual financial goals. The change in my public profile had also affected my relationship with Cedar Rapids and the community where I had lived for 3 decades. Instead of being the object of curiosity and speculation, I was now seen as someone who was using her success to address important social problems. The pastor who had previously made pointed references to stewardship during his sermons now invited me to speak about financial empowerment during the church's women's ministry events. Most importantly, the foundation work had given me a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal financial security. For the first time since Robert's death, I was building something that would outlast my own involvement and create ongoing benefits for people I would never meet. But even as I was gaining recognition and respect for my philanthropic work, I was still living with the complete estrangement from my children that had resulted from the conservatorship hearing. The foundation's success had made me more visible and respected in the broader community, but it had done nothing to repair the family relationships that had been destroyed by their attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent. The silence from David, Marcus, and Sarah had become a permanent feature of my life, a daily reminder that proving my competence had come at the cost of losing the people I had raised and loved for over 30 years. Every achievement in the foundation's work was shadowed by the knowledge that I had no family to share it with, no children to include in the legacy I was building. As I approached the 1-year anniversary of the conservatorship hearing, I realized that the next phase of my story would need to address the most difficult question of all, whether it was possible to rebuild relationships with people who had fundamentally misunderstood me for so long, and whether I even wanted to try. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 18 months after the conservatorship hearing that had shattered our family. I recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately, the careful script she had inherited from her grandmother and used for all important correspondence. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope, unsure whether I was about to read another legal document or something more personal. "Dear Mom," it began, and those 2 words carried more weight than any financial analysis I had ever conducted. "I saw the article about the foundation in the Des Moines Register. I know we haven't spoken since the court case, and I know that's mostly our fault. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realize we owe you more than an apology." The article she referenced had been published the week before, a feature story about the Morrison Institute's success in helping women develop investment expertise and access funding for their businesses. The reporter had interviewed several program participants and described how the foundation was changing the landscape for female entrepreneurs throughout the Midwest. Reading about my work in the newspaper had apparently prompted Sarah to reconsider the assumptions that had led to our estrangement. Her letter continued with observations that showed she was finally beginning to understand the person I had always been, rather than the person she had expected me to be. "I keep thinking about how we treated you, and I'm ashamed," she wrote. "We saw an elderly woman who asked for help with her TV remote, and we decided that meant you couldn't understand anything complex. We never bothered to learn about your background, your education, or your interests. We just assumed we knew everything about you because you were our mother." The letter was 3 pages long, and each paragraph revealed a deeper level of recognition about the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped their treatment of me. Sarah acknowledged that they had been condescending, controlling, and ultimately disrespectful in ways that went far beyond the conservatorship petition. "I understand now that you weren't hiding your success because you were confused or ashamed," she wrote. "You were protecting yourself from people who wouldn't have supported your goals or respected your abilities. Including us. Especially us." She ended the letter with a request that surprised me. "I know we don't deserve it, but I'm hoping you might be willing to meet with me. Not to rehash the past or make excuses, but to start over. I want to know who you really are, not who I assumed you were." I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside and walking to my kitchen window, where I could see the yard Robert and I had planted together 30 years earlier. The trees we had chosen were mature now, their branches reaching across property lines to shade neighbors' gardens, creating beauty that extended beyond our original plans. Sarah's letter was followed by similar messages from Marcus and David over the next 2 weeks. Each of them had reached different conclusions about our estrangement, but all 3 seemed to recognize that they had fundamentally misjudged my capabilities and motivations. Marcus admitted that his banker's training had made him conservative, to the point of limiting his own investment returns. David confessed that his failed business ventures had made him jealous of my success rather than proud of my achievements. Their letters were thoughtful and seemed genuine, but I wasn't sure whether reconciliation was possible or advisable. 18 months of silence had given me time to build a life that didn't depend on their approval or understanding. The foundation work had connected me with people who respected my expertise and shared my goals. I had established professional relationships, friendships, and a sense of purpose that existed entirely outside my family's influence. The question wasn't whether I could forgive them for trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. The question was whether rebuilding our relationship would enhance my life or simply recreate the patterns of condescension and control that had made the charade necessary in the first place. I discussed the situation with Elizabeth Hartman during one of our regular meetings about foundation business. Elizabeth had become not just my attorney but a trusted advisor whose perspective I valued on personal as well as professional matters. "What do you want from a relationship with your children?" she asked. "Not what you think you should want, or what would be socially expected, but what would actually make your life better?" It was a question I had been avoiding because the answer was complicated. I wanted them to understand and respect the person I had become, but I wasn't sure they were capable of that level of change. I wanted to share my experiences and achievements with people who had known me for decades, but I didn't want to return to being treated like a child who needed constant guidance and protection. "I want them to see me as I am, not as they think I should be," I finally said. "But I'm not sure that's possible. Their entire relationship with me has been based on assumptions that are hard to change." Maybe the question isn't whether they can change completely, but whether they can change enough to make a relationship worthwhile, Elizabeth suggested. "You don't have to choose between complete estrangement and total reconciliation. You could build limited relationships that acknowledge both your growth and their limitations." Her advice resonated because it recognized that forgiveness didn't require returning to previous patterns of interaction. I could choose to engage with my children while maintaining the boundaries and independence I had established since the court case. I decided to respond to Sarah's letter first, since her message had seemed the most thoughtful and self-aware. I suggested that we meet for lunch at a restaurant in Cedar Rapids, neutral territory where we could have a conversation without the emotional weight of family history that filled my house. Sarah arrived early and was waiting at a corner table. When I walked into the restaurant, she looked older than I remembered, and there was a tentative quality to her smile that suggested she was as nervous about this meeting as I was. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But your letter made me think that maybe we could find a way to move forward." The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Instead of talking about my needs, my limitations, or my problems, Sarah asked about my investment philosophy, my foundation work, and my plans for the future. She listened without interrupting, asked thoughtful questions, and showed genuine interest in understanding my perspective. "I've been reading about your foundation's programs," she said. The women you're helping, the research you're funding, the changes you're making in how people think about female investors. It's remarkable work. It's the most meaningful thing I've ever done, I told her. More satisfying than any investment return I've achieved. Why didn't you ever tell us you were interested in these kinds of issues? Why didn't you share your goals with us? It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since receiving her letter. Because you never asked what I was interested in. You told me what I should be interested in, what was appropriate for someone my age, what would keep me safe and comfortable. But you never asked what I actually wanted to do with my life. Sarah nodded slowly. We treated you like you were fragile instead of recognizing that you were strong. We assumed that needing help with technology meant you couldn't handle complexity in other areas. We were wrong about everything. The acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected. For 18 months, I had been living with the knowledge that my own children had fundamentally misunderstood me for decades. Hearing Sarah recognize and take responsibility for those misunderstandings felt like a form of validation I hadn't realized I needed. We talked for 2 hours, covering topics we had never discussed during all the years when they thought they knew everything about me. Sarah wanted to understand how I had developed investment expertise, what had motivated me to start the foundation, and how I had maintained confidence while being consistently underestimated. The hardest part wasn't the technical learning, I explained. It was trusting my own judgment when everyone around me assumed I was incapable of making good decisions. Including my own family. We made you doubt yourself, Sarah said quietly. Sometimes. But you also motivated me to prove that you were wrong. I'm not sure I would have been as determined to succeed if I hadn't felt like I had something to prove. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Sarah asked whether I would be willing to meet with Marcus and David as well. We've all been talking about this separately, but I think we need to have a conversation together. To acknowledge what we did wrong and figure out how to do better going forward. I agreed to a family meeting, but with conditions. We would meet at my house, on my terms, and the conversation would focus on moving forward rather than rehashing past grievances. I also made it clear that I expected them to educate themselves about my foundation work before the meeting, so they would understand what I had been building while we weren't speaking. The family meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in November. All 3 of my children arrived together, and I could see immediately that they had been discussing our situation extensively among themselves. They seemed genuinely humbled. In a way that was different from their previous attempts to manage my life. Marcus spoke first, acknowledging that his professional expertise in banking had made him arrogant about investment strategies he didn't actually understand. I thought. I knew more about managing money than you did because I worked at a bank, he said. But your portfolio has outperformed every investment product my bank offers. You were playing a completely different game, and I was too proud to recognize it. David's apology focused on his assumption that technical competence was generational, rather than individual. I thought anyone over 60 was automatically confused by modern technology, he said. I never considered that you might understand systems I'd never heard of, or that your engineering background gave you advantages I didn't have. The most meaningful moment came when Sarah asked about the foundation's future plans and whether there were ways they could support my work without interfering with my autonomy. It was the first time any of them had offered to help with something I cared about, rather than trying to protect me from my own decisions. I don't need financial support, I told them. But I could use family members who understand and respect what I'm trying to accomplish. People who can talk knowledgeably about my work when they encounter questions or criticism in the community. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt relationships that were different from what we had before, but also more honest and respectful. My children made genuine efforts to understand my investment strategies and foundation work, and I made efforts to share my experiences and goals with them. The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments when they slipped back into old patterns of trying to protect me from decisions they didn't understand, and moments when I became defensive about independence I had fought hard to establish. But gradually, we found ways to interact as adults who respected each other's capabilities and choices. The most significant change was that my children began including me in their own financial planning, asking for advice about investment strategies, retirement planning, and major purchases. After years of assuming I needed their guidance, they started recognizing that I might have valuable insights to offer. 2 years after our reconciliation began, the Morrison Institute received a major federal grant to expand our educational programs nationally. The recognition brought national media attention, including a feature story in the Wall Street Journal that described my transformation from dismissed widow to investment powerhouse. The article prompted interview requests from television programs, speaking invitations from major conferences, and consulting opportunities with organizations working on women's financial empowerment. At 66, I had become exactly the kind of public figure I had spent decades avoiding. But the most gratifying response came from my children, who called to congratulate me on the recognition and express pride in what I had accomplished. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I had family members who truly understood and supported my goals. The foundation's success had also created opportunities one hadn't anticipated. Several major universities invited me to teach courses on investment strategy and women's entrepreneurship. Investment firms began seeking my consultation on projects related to female investors and wealth management. Publishers approached me about writing books on investment philosophy and overcoming gender bias in financial services. As I considered these opportunities, I realized that my story had evolved far beyond the original goal of proving my competence to skeptical family members. I had become an advocate, educator, and role model for women who faced similar challenges in being taken seriously as investors and entrepreneurs. The conservatorship hearing that had seemed like a devastating attack on my autonomy had actually become the catalyst for a more public and impactful life than I had ever imagined. The legal victory had preserved my right to control my own finances. But the broader outcome had been the discovery of my ability to influence and inspire others. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, reviewing investment reports that showed my portfolio had surpassed $400 million, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years earlier, I had been exactly what my children thought I was, a conventional widow managing a modest inheritance with conservative investments and limited ambitions. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without costs. I had lost years of family relationships and endured the stress of legal challenges to my autonomy. But I had also discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed and created opportunities for hundreds of other women to achieve similar success. My phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and I answered. To hear my daughter's excited voice describing a new business venture she was considering and asking for my advice on structuring the investment. As I listened to her describe her plans with confidence and sophistication that reminded me of my own journey into complex financial decision-making, I realized that perhaps the most important outcome of my story wasn't the wealth I had accumulated, or the foundation I had built. It was the demonstration that assumptions about what people can accomplish are often wrong, and that it's never too late to become more than anyone expected you to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.